So I'm just need to. Pops,
Yes,
is
sir.
your WhatsApp on? Is your WhatsApp on?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, I'm using my phone. Look, I'm using my phone for better lighting.
Okay.
So I think that, can you please use the other number, not the one that I just got, the other one.
Okay.
What do you need it for, by the way?
We will just start like in 5 minutes.
It's just that. Okay. So that was the perfect spot that we chose for.
Okay, then open the camera. Are you going live now? No.
Yeah. Is this message an SMS?
Okay.
You gotta make it full screen.
No, I don't want to make it full screen. I want to be able to see the text that I'm going to be using.
Pops?
Yes, sir.
Okay. So we will just officially start now.
All
right. So good evening, ladies and gentlemen, to all of you who have tuned in via Facebook. We are happy that you have joined. We are happy that you have taken your time to join us on waiting for this Adventist colloquium on the Bible and colonization. I'm just trying to. We welcome all of you who have joined us for this colloquium. We have waited for a very long time for it. And so we welcome all of you. Today, my name is Ainam Jokwana, and I'm going to be the one that's going to be facilitating this particular session. As we said, that the colloquium was an Adventist colloquium on the Bible and colonization. A few house rules before we introduce the speaker. The house rules are as follows. Number one, we are going to have a presentation that is about 20 to 25 minutes long. And then thereafter, we're going to have a 15 minutes question and answer session. So if you want to comment, and if you have got a question for the one who's going to present, feel free to make that question and comment on this Facebook page. Very important that the only questions that are going to be taken note of are questions that are relevant to this particular presentation. And so without further ado, I would like to take this time to introduce our speaker for this evening. Our speaker is none other than Obakeng Africa, a man who carries theology with his heart. And I always say this is a very intelligent man. So we are honored and privileged to be listening to Obakeng Africa this evening. And Obakeng Africa will be talking to us on the task of theology in South Africa revisited. Obakeng completed his Bachelor's of Theology degree at Helderberg College of Higher Education. He then continued to do a Bachelor of Honors Theology in Systematic Theology. And then, of course, he went to he's currently doing his Master's degree in Theology at the University of South Africa, where he's currently busy. So at this point in time, we are going to give time over to him. And so the task of theology revisited, ladies and gentlemen, Obakeng Africa. Obakeng.
Thank you very much. I'd just like to put timer.
Obakeng.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh, all right.
I can.
Thank you very much. I just want to put a timer here just to make sure that I stick to the allotted time of 20 minutes. All right, the clock has started. Thank you very much for that very warm introduction. It's always an honor to get the privilege to speak in public spaces because not everyone has the time or the energy to be doing the kind of work that theologians decide to do, and it's for good reason that not everyone is a theologian. And even though not everyone is a theologian, it doesn't mean that theologians are important, which is why I find this opportunity to be a privilege. With that said, I'd like to make a few preliminary remarks about the essay that I'm going to be engaging with in the presentation that I'll be giving today. So this presentation is basically a treatment of an essay written by Simon Maimela, a South African liberation theologian, and he wrote an essay in 1987 titled "The Task of Theology in South Africa Revisited." And the task of theology in South Africa today, right? So let us take note of the fact that in the 1987.
Obakeng. 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 Ladies and gentlemen, that is what technology is currently doing, but we are asking for your patience. He will definitely be back online very soon. So let's just give Obakeng a chance to come back. Okay.
Oh yes, I am
Okay.
back and the network is strong again. Please excuse that disruption.
Okay.
Let me just leave that. All right, so without further ado, I should probably go into the heart of the matter. So, Maimela, in this essay, Maimela discusses the nature of theology, and one of the things that he mentions is that theology is unlike many other disciplines, because theology is an attempt to to reflect critically and express in the clearest language possible what it means to be involved in the divine, creative and redemptive process of living. In other words, unlike other disciplines where it is simply a study of a particular object from an objective position, theology is an inherently subjective discipline. So anyone who goes into this discipline must understand the kinds of commitments it is that they are going to be making. Now, there are two things that I perhaps would like to make further note of in this understanding of Maimela of theology. And the first one is that theology is a critical reflection, and theology, according to Maimela, is a reflective exercise, and this reflection needs to happen in the clearest manner. And this means that theology needs to happen in a grounded way, whereby we're not simply just taking abstract metaphysical truths and delineating them, but rather we talk about our lived experience and how it is that we are living the truth. But this must happen in the clearest language possible. But you see, with that said, Maimela felt it necessary to also go further in his understanding of theology by actually pointing out a specific problem that there is in our attempt of understanding what theology is in the South African context. And remember, South Africa, as we speak about it, it is colonial apartheid South Africa. Now, I'll explain further on why it is that I am making the connection between colonialism and apartheid. But in his he notes that there's a discrepancy between now this task of now before entering into a discussion of this task of theology, Maimela notes that there are three categories of people that he noted who had an opinion on what the task of theology is. So some of those, they saw theology as simply a purely cerebral exercise where people come together and they look at these metaphysical truths and they try and expand on them. Others, they saw theology in a more functional manner, and that is theology, its function is just to make sure that we evangelize to people and they come into the church. But there are also those who saw theology as primarily overcoming the sinful and destructive social relations that we had. And that is the particular group that Maimela belonged to. Now, Maimela felt that in light of the fact that he's one of these people, it is important for him and for any theologian for that matter who wants to talk about what the task of theology is, to declare the position and context from which they're speaking from in all candor, in order for this to be an honest and transparent process. So this context he identified with oppressed Black people, which is why he had the particular articulations of what theology is. And perhaps I should mention part of the reason why it is that this is the first presentation of the other ones that we are having, is that what we are actually trying to do here is not simply to think about what the task of theology is, but rather what is the task of this very colloquium that we are having in the South Africa that we are living in 2020. Now, to think a little bit through that, I did a bit of a comparison between what Maimela saw as South Africa and what a scholar, a psychologist, the first clinical psychologist in South Africa, saw as the state of affairs in South Africa. So Chabani Manganyi, when he looked at South Africa, first of all, he described it in one term, and that term was what he called ideological totalism. Now, that is the South Africa that he saw. When we talk about apartheid South Africa, we are talking about ideological totalism. Now, what is ideological totalism? It is basically an ideology that is taken to its logical extreme. So it doesn't matter whether it is coming from the left or it is coming from the right. All that matters is that it is an ideology that is taken to an extreme. Now, in order for us to sort of understand what this ideological totalism consisted of, he did a breakdown and analysis of it, which I won't go into too much detail, but suffice it to say that he talked about human beings' relationship with their own bodies, meaning that what is our self-image as a people? He talked about being in the world with other people, meaning what are the social relations that we have? What kind of community patterns and formations do we have as a people? Being in the world with objects, what is our relationship with the material objects that we have, from money to cars to houses and so forth, and being in the world within time. In other words, what is our relationship with time? And suffice it to say that in all four of these registers, ideological totalism meant the destruction of the being of the black. Now, that is precisely, and this analysis of Chabani Manganyi, who had psychological concerns when he was analyzing South Africa, is very similar to that, to the analysis that we find in Maimela's analysis of South Africa in the same era that he was writing in. Now, what is interesting about all these problems that we find, where the situation of oppression is not simply that we are disenfranchised politically or economically, but it is that this state of affairs seems not to have changed all that much. And perhaps to justify what it is that I am saying, it is important for me to actually turn to somebody who has done this analysis. And in this regard, perhaps I should look at Joel Mudiru, who is a lawyer. And what Joel Mudiru has to say about South Africa today, he says the following: the constitutional transformation of South Africa effected change in every area of society except where it really matters. Names of streets and buildings were changed. New faces occupied the seats of government power. Official publications were published in a plethora of African languages. A new flag was designed and a new national anthem was composed. A number of old apartheid-era laws were repealed, and the ubiquitous whites-only signs were taken down. But consider that in contrast to these spectacular changes in quote-unquote, actual arrangements of economic power, land and property ownership, spatial segregation, epistemic violence, Western imperialism, psychic trauma, labor exploitation were all left untouched in this new constitutional dispensation. And in order to understand or appreciate the argument that Mudiri makes, we ought to look at history from what we call a longue-durée perspective. Now, what is a longue-durée perspective? That is a look at history over a very long duration in order to understand the deep structures of the institutions and the forces that drive history. Now, Joel Mudiri argues that taking the longue-durée perspective has the following benefits. First of all, it challenges the episodic view of history where there's the colonial era, there's the apartheid era, and there's the constitutional era of democracy. In other words, when I say colonial apartheid, I am making that longue-durée connection, which is why I call it colonial apartheid. And in fact, Joel Mudiri argues that we are living in a post-apartheid South Africa. Now, I'll say a little bit more about that. But the second benefit that Mudiri points to is that it helps us to understand why apartheid is legally abolished, and yet all its vestiges remain prevalent. Third, it helps us to look at the superficial dimensions, to look past the superficial dimensions of political life, and it lays bare the essential elements of the structure of oppression that remain intact despite regime changes. In other words, even though there might be a black face there, we need to be able to see the white fingerprints in the power, in the patterns of power arrangements that we have. Now, the fourth benefit that he mentions is that it redraws the temporal boundaries that take us back to sources in the archive of resistance that would otherwise be forgotten or erased due to their perceived obsolescence. Now, and in part, my revisiting of this essay is an attempt of stating that we are not living in post-apartheid South Africa, but we are living in post-apartheid South Africa. And therefore, people like Maimela, people like Chabane Mangani, people like I.B. Kabata, people like Steve Biko, they remain relevant. People like Takatso Mufokeng, who wrote a powerful Christology that we need to revisit as theologians in South Africa. Now, Joel Mudiri, when he talks about as he moves on, what he says is the following. In sum, the critique of the Constitution contests the hegemonic temporal framings in order to register the reminder that neither 1984 nor the advent of constitutional democracy signaled the end of white supremacy and black people's struggle against it. Mudiri points out that the South African Constitution is constitutional worship.
Okay, Obakeng. Just a pause. We lost you just a while. You were speaking about the Constitution and Mudiri, where you were making the quotation. Can you take us from there?
All right. Mudiri points out that South African Constitution is an important rallying point of contestation, and he argues that the worship of the Constitution is a legal and political theology that views the promulgation of the new national constitution after conflict as substantive and a symbolic break with the past. And yet, that is definitely not the case, because the very people who are the beneficiaries of colonialism, the people who are the beneficiaries of apartheid, remain the beneficiaries of constitutional democracy, which is why it is important for us to then engage with a concept that is very important, which is what Mudiri calls the afterlife. So the notion of the afterlife, as opposed to the aftermath, is the one that will help us to understand what is going on. So according to Mudiri subscribes to this notion where we say that what we are seeing is the afterlife. And this is what he has to say about the afterlife. He says the afterlife of colonial apartheid describes the multiple forms of precarity and vulnerability, poverty, landlessness, neglect, indignity, powerlessness, skewed life chances, dilapidated infrastructure, exploitation, marginalization, incarceration, limited access to healthcare and quality education, and spatial dislocation and psychic alienation that endure in the wake of the formal abolition of apartheid. So, in other words, what we must understand is that the task of theology is not simply to pick up the pieces after the damage that was done by apartheid, but the task of theology is to address the ongoing effects of colonial apartheid, or what in short some scholars call coloniality, which is basically colonization after the colonial administrators have left the colony.
Yes, sir.
Okay, I'm back online. All right. So
Okay.
perhaps to come to the task of theology, there are 4 tasks that Maimela tells us about, and I will just briefly peruse over them. I'll briefly peruse over these tasks. The first one is the promotion of the process of individual and social transformation. Right. The second one is the revitalization, the relativization, of all absolutes which enslave the people of God. The fourth task of theology is the humanization of human conditions and activity. And so that was the third task. And the fourth task is a construction of a more humane picture of the world. Now, perhaps to explain a little bit more in each of these. First of all, I made reference to Chabane Manganye earlier on in the comparison, making a comparison between his assessment of the South African situation and Maimela's assessment of the situation, and I discussed the similarity. Now, the reason why I specifically went to a psychologist in order to look at these issues is because we are not simply looking at political problems here. We are looking at psychic problems, meaning that even if the social and the political arrangements may be sorted out, there's also the psychological issues that we need to deal with. And here, one of the reasons why this is so important is because mental health has become a very prominent topic in our discourse, but I think it is flippantly discussed, where we simply use buzzwords like anxiety and depression, and that we don't go into the causes of this psychic damage and the psychic trauma that we experience as a result of these social, economic, and political arrangements that were made by the oppressor, right? Now, this means that part of the task of theology is not simply to say these political arrangements are bad, but it is also to say that we need to heal, right? And we need to think about the different theological themes or the different cluster of questions around these things. So in other words, to give one example, theological anthropology, which is the doctrine of humanity, it needs to deal with the psychic trauma of the Black person, especially the Black female in South Africa. So we cannot say what is a human being, and we don't talk about how the human was deformed, because coloniality more than any other doctrine deformed the doctrine of humanity the most. And that means that we need to address those, right? The second task is that of the revitalization of absolutes. And here there are different types of absolutes that we could make reference to. Manganye, when he talks about the absolutes, there are different types of absolutes that he talks about, and he calls them psychological markers, basically, right? But the one that I think is most important for us to talk about is racism and xenophobia, right? Those two. And they are basically two sides of the same coin. Well, basically, there's a certain type of prejudice that white people, you know, that white people inflicted against black people. And now xenophobia is that prejudice, that dehumanization being inflicted by black people on one another. And this is because of the fact that there are certain absolutes that we hold on to. In other words, you look at yourself, you see Umxhosa, or I look at myself, I see Motswana. And we are unable to look past that and just see ourselves as the image of God, right? And we need to relativize those identity markers that end up compromising another person's quality of life, right? Now, the third one is the humanization of actions and activities. Now, with this one, why it is important is because not only do we have the privilege of being important and decisive actors in terms of the fate of humankind and the planet, but we have a responsibility to make sure that we undo these structures of oppression that we set up and these destructive arrangements that we have and the relationship we have even with the earth and the animals, right? And this means that humanization is where we remind ourselves that global warming is is a result of human activity, and it can be undone for human beings, and we have the responsibility of doing that, and we have the ability of actually participating in the redemptive activity that Maimela referred to, right? So it means that redemption mustn't simply be seen as a spiritual phenomenon. It needs to be seen as an ecological phenomenon, a social phenomenon, a psychological phenomenon, because there are many.
Okay. Hold on a little bit, Obakeng. Ops. Hello, Ops. Can you hear me? Ops. Obakeng. Okay, we seem to have a few network challenges, but we are just waiting for him to quickly come back. He's definitely on his way back. So we are really asking for patience. Yeah, technology has got its issues, but we hope to finish. Okay, we are just waiting. Okay. We are asking for a little bit of patience. Right. Ops, are you back?
Yes, I'm back.
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I
I can
can.
hear you.
I wanted you for you to go back where you spoke about salvation, where you actually spoke about salvation that would be necessary, not within the socially, psychologically. I want you to actually start from there, and then we can continue from there.
All right. No, thank you very much. Okay, so I think for the moment, is it fine if I can just keep my video off? Because I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why I'm struggling with network.
Okay. No, it's fine.
All right. Thank you very much. So what I was saying is that salvation must be understood as a multifaceted phenomenon. In other words, it is not enough for us. It is not enough for us. It's a bit of feedback. Okay, it's not enough for us to simply think about it as, a spiritual thing where, I would like to go to heaven, but rather we need to see salvation as a multi-pronged process, a multi-pronged project whereby we are going to be dealing with, issues around climate change. We are dealing with issues around psychological matters. We're dealing with social issues. So it means that the pastor is as responsible for the salvation of the people as a social worker is responsible for the salvation of the people, as a doctor is responsible for the salvation of the people. Right? Now, it is so perhaps to put this into a context that is a little bit more familiar with us. When Jesus teaches us how to pray, what does he say? Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth, as it is in heaven. And the very next stanza, what does it say? It says, give us this day our daily bread. In other words, when we think about what the will of God is, we also need to understand that it is not simply going to church and doing the spiritual disciplines that we do when we are at church, but it also entails addressing the physical needs that people have. It also means that we need to condemn any unjust social arrangements that we see, which is what we saw, for instance, the prophet Amos doing, right? Prophet Amos was very instrumental in pointing out the injustices of Israel. Right, and he wasn't unaware of the injustices of Judah, his home country. He also pointed out those injustices, right? Perhaps I should go to now the fourth task of theology. Yes,
just
sir.
to pause you a little bit. So time is running out. We just have so we are going to use rather the last 5 minutes in order for question and answer due to the break. But I wanted to know if it's possible for you to maybe sum it up.
Yes, I can do that, and thank you for having patience with me. To sum it up, this is what I will say: the task of theology in South Africa is for South African theologians or South African Christians to actually take the newspaper, take the Bible, put it side by side, read the text in context, right? When I say the text, I'm talking about the Bible, context, the newspaper. Let us read the text in context, because both these, they speak to one another, right? So I think, in short, that is what I will summarize what the task of theology in South Africa today as being. And thank you very much.
We would like to take this opportunity, guys, to thank Obakeng for this wonderful and amazing presentation on the task of theology revisited in South Africa. We would like to thank Obakeng for that wonderful presentation on the task of theology revisited. It was amazing. Let me just look at the comments to tell you what we have been receiving. And so the first comment is that, so these are the comments that we are getting. Redemption Baba. And then he needs to repeat that, but I'm not sure what was that needed to be repeated. I just want to check all of the comments so to see if there are no questions. So someone, Sandile Busakwe, is saying thank you, very, very, very. He says enkosi bro. So we would like to say thank you for the presentation that you have offered to us. Now, I wanted to ask a question, and I don't know if it would be safe to ask this particular question. The question, of course, or maybe we are probably going to talk about it in the future, is the issue of addressing text and context with regards to the formulation of creeds. And so one of the challenges then I guess is also trying to remain truthful, in your process of trying to revisit the task of theology. How do you get to do that in trying to balance out, what is expected, or the creeds, looking into the fact that we first need to read the text in context?
All right. So, okay, so the question that you're asking relates to a concept, or a dilemma that Moltmann once talked about, and that is the identity involvement dilemma, where on the one hand we have an identity that we need to preserve. So, for instance, I am a confessing Seventh-day Adventist Christian, right? But at the same time, I'm a South African. So, there are things that happen in South Africa that are particular to South Africa. And there's a certain sense in which it will be an inadequate response for me to perhaps take out, the fundamental beliefs in order for me to adequately address. It is not to say that they cannot address the issues or our worldview in a way that is relevant to our lived experience. But it is important for us to also take seriously the fact that we are a people that are living in a specific geographical area, in a specific configuration of political, social, economic, and juridical arrangements, right? So let me perhaps make an example that we can resonate with as Adventists, and that is that of National Sunday Law. This has been an ongoing anxiety among us as Adventists. But just because it is an ongoing anxiety does not mean that every single Adventist in the world is experiencing the same thing. You might find that a legislation is passed here in South Africa, and it means that we here in South Africa need to actually formulate a response that is tailor-made for the particular situation that we find ourselves in. So that is not to say that we are going to discount our identity, but that is to say that we need to be appropriately involved in the situation that we find ourselves in. So when we look at our situation and we see a situation of oppression, we need to say, what is the nature of this oppression? Because take for instance, let me make another example that perhaps will resonate with the Black radical tradition, and that is oppression as experienced in Africa and as experienced by Blacks in Africa, and oppression as experienced by Blacks in the United States. We here, I as Obakeng Africa, I'm able to say that on the other hand, my United States counterpart, Black counterpart, is unable to talk about his clan names. So that means that the crisis that they are facing is.
Oops. Okay. Right, so we have another network challenge and our time is running out. I'm not sure if there are any other questions that we could perhaps take. If there's any person maybe that is watching that actually wants to ask a question to Obakeng, please feel free. Our time is actually running out. And if we can not ask the question now at this point in time, you can throw it on the page and we will certainly forward that page to him. So we are not left with much time at all. We are literally left with 3 minutes, but we will see what we can do. Right. So at this point in time, we would like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Obakeng for giving us this presentation. Please join us tomorrow night join us tomorrow night, same time, same place, facilitator Sandile Busakwe. So we are going to sign out. Thank you very, very, very much, and we hope that you have a good night. Thank you.